Remind me, my Lord, who I am. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. I am love, I am love, pure love. I am love, I am love, pure love. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. I am peace, I am peace, divine peace. I am peace, I am peace, divine peace. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. I am joy, I am joy, endless joy. I am joy, I am joy, endless joy. Ananda Swarupa, He Prema Swarupa, Ananda Swarupa, Ananda Swarupa, He Prema Swarupa, Ananda Swarupa. Shanti Om, Shanti Om, Shanti Om, Shanti Om, Shanti Om, Shanti Om. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. I am Om, I am Om, eternal Om. I am Om, I am Om, eternal Om. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. Remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, remind me, my Lord, who I am. I am light, I am light, radiant light. I am light, I am light, radiant light.
ॐ अङ्गुष्ठमात्रः पुरुषोऽन्तरात्मा सदा जनानां हृदये सन्निविष्टः tam svacharirat pravrihin munjadiveshikam dhairyena tam vidyat chukramamritam tam vidyat chukramamritamiti. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, the Purusha, the inner soul, who is no larger than a thumb, resides always in the heart of everyone. One should separate that soul with patience from one's own body, just as one separates a blade of grass from its main fiber. Know that soul to be pure, bright, and immortal. Know that soul to be pure, bright, and immortal. Katha Upanishad 2.3.17. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you so much to Swami Nirvananda Saraswati for this amazing bhajan. It's very difficult to follow that kind of song. And I appreciate also that at the last minute, he modified the song to segue into this talk with the last verse. I'm the radiant light within. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. A few weeks ago, we were blessed to have Swami Sarvapriyanji here to grace us with his presence for almost a week. And he gave some really amazing talks and classes. His Sunday talk was called Eternal Serene Luminosity. And maybe when you heard the title of my talk, The Radiant Light Within, you might have thought, is this going to be a cheap imitation of Sarvapriyananda? Or what's going on here? I hope not, at least. I hope this talk is complementary. It should complement the kind of talks that Sarvapriyanji gives, these amazing talks that he gives, because he teaches the path of knowledge typically from the standpoint of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. I don't think that's controversial to say. And what I want to talk about today is the path of knowledge, but for bhaktas. A bhakti-oriented jnana yoga, a bhakti-oriented path of knowledge, a path of knowledge that one can practice even within the framework of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. That's what I want to talk about. And you might be surprised to hear this. What in the world is a bhakti-oriented jnana yoga? It sounds like a contradiction in terms. You're trying to square a circle. No, so the whole talk is going to be making a case that, in fact, it's not just that jnana yoga is compatible with bhakti, but that it's a necessary practice within the framework even of devotion toward a personal God. Okay? I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's school, has a monopoly on this path of knowledge, and that's absolutely wrong. So if you want an alternative title for the talk, it could be called Jnana Yoga for Bhaktas or Jnana Yoga for the rest of us. Okay. So some of the questions I want to address here, I want to tackle. What exactly is the path of knowledge in bhakti traditions, especially the Vijnana Vedanta philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna, which is, for most of us, our main tradition? But also, what are the benefits of this bhakti-oriented path of knowledge, this bhakti-oriented jnana yoga? How exactly does it differ from the path of knowledge taught by Shankara and his followers, the path of knowledge in classical Advaita Vedanta? Why is it so important, even for bhaktas, to practice this special bhakti-oriented path of knowledge? And how do we combine bhakti-oriented jnana yoga with the other yogas in our daily spiritual practice? And I'm making, now, all of this should add up to a case. I'm making a controversial case, and this is my claim. That it's better, safer, more practical, and more fruitful for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants to practice the kind of bhakti-oriented jnana yoga taught by Sri Ramakrishna, Ramanuja, and others than the classical Advaitic path of knowledge taught by Shankara and his followers. Okay, very controversial claim, I know, and you can feel free to argue with me in the Q&A afterward, but this is what today's talk will be about. So, to begin with, we need a very brief sense of what exactly is the classical Advaitic understanding of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. So very briefly, 3 main practices: Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. Shravana, hearing. What do you hear? You hear a Mahavakya. There are some main Mahavakyas picked out by classical Advaitins. One of them, for instance, is Aham Brahmasmi. I am non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? Hear it first from a qualified guru. Second, manana. Reflect on that teaching. Remove doubts about that teaching, just at an intellectual level. But then third, nididhyasana. Try to internalize that teaching in your day-to-day life. Okay? And the philosophy that has to be kept in mind when you're engaged in the classical Advaitic path of knowledge is this famous formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. Non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman, alone is real from the absolute standpoint. Jagat Mithya, this world ultimately is non-existent, this whole world of names and forms. Only real from the empirical standpoint, not from the ultimate standpoint. And Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. I, in my deepest essence, am that non-dual pure consciousness. That is the whole of Advaita Vedanta. And the practice needs to be based on that, okay? So ultimately, notice there are 2 key features in this, which is going to be important coming up when I explain the different kind of Jnana Yoga from a bhakti standpoint. Number 1, you shouldn't be practicing bhakti at the same time that you're practicing classical Advaita Jnana Yoga. Why? Because they're meant, bhakti yoga and karma yoga are meant for inferior spiritual aspirants who are not eligible to practice Jnana Yoga because they have insufficiently pure minds. So through the practice of bhakti yoga and karma yoga, you purify your mind, thereby making yourself eligible to practice the higher practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, which can lead to the highest goal. But once you start practicing Jnana Yoga, according to Shankara's school, you should not be practicing karma yoga and bhakti yoga at the same time. They're meant for different grades of spiritual aspirant. What's the logic behind it? Because the personal God is ultimately unreal. So if I'm practicing Jnana Yoga and also worshiping the personal God, I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm reinforcing duality. God is separate from me and this and that. That's the logic. And secondly, how should I look upon this world? According to classical Advaitins, look upon the world as a dream, as an illusion, as an illusory snake superimposed upon a real rope. Okay? So keep all that in mind. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about a different kind of Jnana Yoga, which I bet you guys don't know nearly as much about, if anything. But let's start. Before going into Sri Ramakrishna's teachings about Jnana Yoga, let's first look at Ramanuja. Okay? Ramanuja was a great bhakta and acharya who developed the philosophy of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, which is usually translated as qualified non-dualism. One thing that many people don't know is that he strongly emphasizes the need for Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. But he kind of turns the tables on Shankara. Remember, what does Shankara say? Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga are preparatory disciplines to purify the mind, to make you eligible to practice the higher practice of Jnana Yoga, which alone leads to moksha, liberation. Ramanuja says Jnana Yoga, in combination with certain Vaidhi Bhakti practices, which means kind of standard devotional practices, and Karma Yoga, are a prerequisite for Bhakti Yoga, which is the highest practice, which alone leads to liberation. So he's just literally flipping the tables. Okay. So what does Ramanuja mean by Jnana Yoga? The path of knowledge. What he means is meditate on your true nature as the Jivatman, as the eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Meditate on your true nature as the Jivatman, the eternal soul, the radiant light within, separate from the body-mind complex. That's Jnana Yoga according to Ramanuja. But the harder question is, why in the world would he recommend that? Why is it helpful? Why is that a prerequisite for the practice of bhakti? The reason is, you won't feel true bhakti, true love for God. You won't have any genuine feeling for God until you have realized your spiritual nature as an eternal soul, which is a spark of the divine fire. Until you've realized yourself as an eternal child of the divine. Until we've attained that realization, we identify with the body. We identify with the mind. It's not the body or the mind that feels genuine devotion for God. It's only the deeper soul within. That's the logic. We cannot feel true bhakti until we have broken our identification with the body-mind complex. Therefore, Ramanuja says, practice bhakti. Of course you should. But that's not bhakti yoga, strictly speaking, in Ramanuja's sense. We'll get to that in a second. Practice bhakti, come to these lectures, come to arati, worship God, do your japa, all these things. Pray. Do your karma yoga at the same time, and practice jnana yoga. What's the culmination of these combined practices? Atma avalokanam is the Sanskrit term used by Ramanuja. Direct spiritual realization of your true nature as the Atman, but here Atman means the Jivatma, the individual soul, the eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. Only then are you eligible to practice bhakti yoga in the strict sense, which Ramanuja defines very precisely as constantly thinking of God. Constantly thinking of God. You might think that's not that impressive. It's extraordinarily difficult to think of God constantly. Go ahead and try. You'll start for 5 seconds and then suddenly you'll start thinking about, I'm a little hungry. What are we going to have for lunch today? That's the problem. Because we don't really in our heart of hearts love God as much as we love the things of the world. That's our problem. So what's the solution? The combined practice of Vaidhi Bhakti, Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, purify our minds, reduce our worldly attachments and desires. And then finally, we realize our true nature as eternal souls. As a soul, we are already bhaktas. I'll get to that in a second, that Swamiji says it directly in a very beautiful way. We're already bhaktas. We don't need to cultivate bhakti. We're already bhaktas. But because we identify with the body-mind complex, we don't feel that innate bhakti that we have for God. It's only when we identify with the soul that that innate bhakti that's already within us will manifest. Okay? So now, one thing before I move on from Ramanuja to Sri Ramakrishna. He wrote a text called Vedanta Sangraha. I bet many of you haven't even heard of the text, but I want to read one line. He explains very beautifully and succinctly why realization of the soul is so essential in spiritual life and for developing true bhakti. Atmabhimano yadrishaha tad anuguna eva purushartha pratitihi. Means one's values and aims in life are determined by how one thinks of oneself. Let me repeat that. One's values and aims in life are determined by how one thinks of oneself. So long as I think of myself as a body, I'm going to look at all of you as bodies. So long as I'm in my own intellectual world, I think of myself as a mind, I'll look at you as minds, or some combination of bodies and minds. But when I start to think of myself as a soul, I start looking at each of you as souls, using body and mind as instruments. And that's a kind of spiritual revolution. It completely changes your outlook on life. The world will be transformed overnight if instead of looking at ourselves and others as bodies or as minds, we would start looking at each other as souls. This is what Ramanuja means. Every value in our life changes. Our values become spiritualized, right? At this point, you might be wondering, so now Medhananda is finally coming out. He's admitting he's a follower of Ramanuja. I knew it all along. Not so fast. I think that there's a lot to learn from all the great acharyas, Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, and others, and that we neglect, unfortunately, the bhakti schools of Vedanta. We study Shankara to such an extent that we forget about the other great traditions of Vedanta. That's why Swami Tapasanji, one of the great monks of our order, a former vice president, he wrote an entire book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta to highlight the non-classical Advaitic schools within Vedanta. So we have a lot to learn from Ramanuja. At the same time, there are some differences, important differences, between Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta and Ramanuja's philosophy of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. But in the context of Jnana Yoga, I think that there are deep similarities. The way that Ramanuja understood Jnana Yoga and the way that Sri Ramakrishna understands Jnana Yoga in the bhakti context are very similar, or at least I'll make that case. So now we get to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. The term I've coined to capture his philosophy is Vijnana Vedanta. Why? Because he talks constantly about a very special spiritual experience called Vijnana. He says it's like trying to get to the roof by climbing the steps one by one. And the sadhana there is neti neti. He says, not this, not this. Brahman is not these stairs, it's not this, it's not that, until you reach the roof. Reaching the roof signifies jnana, what Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana. Knowledge of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, separate from the body-mind complex. And you feel the world to be unreal. And you don't even believe in the personal God anymore. Brahma Shakti Jagat Mithya. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But then he says, the Vijnani is the person who, after reaching the roof, looks back at the staircase and says, wait a minute, but the stairs are made of the same materials as the roof. Bricks, lime, brick dust. He says the Vijnani realized that reality which is nirguna, impersonal and attributeless, is also saguna, personal, Shakti. And that Shakti, that same divine reality, has become everything in this world, the 24 cosmic principles. So that instead of looking upon this world as a dream, as an illusion, the Vijnani sees this entire world as a luminous manifestation of the divine. Okay? So we already know the famous formula in Sanskrit to capture classical Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. What would be the equivalent for Vijnana Vedanta? I've come up with this. Take it for whatever it's worth. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. The ultimate reality is not just Brahman, but also Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna says that again and again. Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. They're just different aspects of the same infinite divine reality. And Jagat Satyam. This world is also real as a manifestation of Shakti, of the divine. So this, I hope, captures Vijnana Vedanta in a nutshell and explains the difference between Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. And now we will have a better understanding of in what sense Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy differs on the one hand from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and from Ramanuja's. Sri Ramakrishna was broad. He was very broad. So he fully accepted Shankara's Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness. Where he thinks Shankara makes a mistake is to limit the ultimate reality just to Nirguna Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna would say again and again, never place a limit to God. Never say God can only be this and not more. He says exactly the same thing to Ramanuja. He'll say, wonderful Ramanuja, you believe in God as Saguna Brahman, as Vishnu. I do too. Absolutely, Vishnu is real. But don't limit God just to Vishnu. Ramanuja does not accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman in Shankara's sense. He doesn't accept the reality of non-dual pure consciousness, whereas Sri Ramakrishna does. Brahma Shakti is Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of ultimate reality. Ramanuja will say ultimate reality is just Vishnu. So that's a key difference. That's why it's important not to equate Sri Ramakrishna with either Shankara or with Ramanuja, because he's broader than both. He doesn't limit God just to Vishnu or just to Nirguna Brahman. He accepts God as the infinite divine reality, which is impersonal in one aspect and personal, Shakti, in the other aspect. And that Shakti manifests in countless forms, as all the different forms that we know. Also, with regard to spiritual practices, if you study traditional Vedantic schools, you'll find that each one of them teaches a hierarchy of yogas. One yoga alone is the highest, and is direct, is the best. Shankara plays that game, Ramanuja plays that game, Madhva, they all do it, without exception. Sri Ramakrishna says all of these different yogas are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal, and that we can even combine them to our heart's content without feeling any conflict or guilt. So that's another difference between Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta and traditional schools of Vedanta. At the same time, this is also important, and it kind of forces us to nuance our understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's views on spiritual practice. He says again and again, any objective reader of the gospel will feel this, that bhakti yoga is the best path for our age. He says it a million times. I'll quote one of these statements from December 14th, 1882. In the Kali Yuga, which is our current age, the life of human beings is centered on food. People cannot get rid of the feeling that they are the body and the ego. Therefore, the path of devotion is prescribed for this cycle. This is an easy path. You will attain God if you sing her name and glories and pray to her with a longing heart. There is not the least doubt about it. What's he saying? The best path, even though all the yogas can take us to the highest goal, the best path for most people under current circumstances is the path of bhakti. The main reason being because we're so strongly identified with the body and the ego. Okay? And for the same reason, he said, don't practice the Jnana Yoga taught by classical Advaita Vedantins. He said it many times in the Gospel. And I want to read you his, you can say his strongest caution against practicing classical Advaita Vedanta. This is from page 123 of the Bengali Kathamrita. He says, the feeling I am Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, is not good. Ami shei obiman bhalo noy. A person who thinks this way while still having body consciousness does great harm to himself or herself. Dehatma buddhi thakte je ei obiman kore, tar bishesh hani hoy. That person cannot make any progress in spiritual life. Igute pare na. In fact, that person is dragged down into worldliness and bondage. Krome odopoton hoy. He deceives himself as well as others. Porke tokai, abar nijeke tokai. He cannot even understand his plight. Nijer avastha bujhtei pare na. Very strong language. And I think we should be haunted by this. Because these days, there are many people talking about classical Advaita Vedanta, and they've dropped the eligibility requirements that Shankara so strongly emphasized. Sadhana chatushtaya, you have to be perfect in sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana. And we don't have time to go through all of them, but you know, perfect purity, viveka, vairagya, discrimination between the real and the unreal, what's permanent and impermanent, intense detachment toward everything in the world, and many other very high, lofty spiritual qualities. How many of us can claim to be perfect in these sadhanas, in these qualities? Almost none of us. Shankara says, so long as you're not, don't practice Advaita Vedanta. Don't practice the path of knowledge that I'm teaching. It's not for you. And yet these days now, the floodgates have been opened. And now almost everybody wants to practice and thinks they're eligible to practice Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's why we should keep in mind Sri Ramakrishna's cautionary note. In fact, in his own life, there's an example. A monk came from outside of West Bengal, an Advaitic sannyasi from Punjab maybe. And Sri Ramakrishna heard that he was having an affair with a woman, which is obviously, it breaks the monastic vows. And so he approaches this monk and says, what is this I hear about what you're doing? And he says, because Sri Ramakrishna was very straightforward and blunt, so he just asked him about it. And the monk said, oh, completely unfazed. Oh, let me explain. You see, this whole world is unreal. It's a dream. It's an illusion. So how can my affair with that one lady be real? It has to be unreal too. So I can still, there's no problem. It's all part of the same dream. Sri Ramakrishna used such strong language to rebuke him that it's kind of watered down in all the translations that are available. He says, I spit on your Vedanta. That's the English translation, the watered down version. The true translation, the original is, Tor Vedanta mute di. I piss on your Vedanta. Sorry for the language. But the strong language is important. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why he's using such strong language. We need a rude awakening sometimes to realize the depths of our degradation. Now, at the same time, let's come back to this point that he makes, which is that all these different yogas can take us to the highest goal. At the same time, bhakti yoga is the best for most of us. I don't want you to come away thinking, I don't think this would be the right way to interpret him, as to say that, therefore, we should practice bhakti and not practice karma yoga and jnana yoga and raja yoga. No. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna understood, as all the great saints did, that these yogas are not in airtight compartments. They overlap with each other. And in fact, this is the way I see it, and you can disagree with me. I see Sri Ramakrishna as saying, keep bhakti yoga as the nucleus, if you want to use a metaphor for physics, old physics, particle physics. Nucleus. And the other yogas as floating around it, supplementing it. Karma yoga, jnana yoga, raja yoga. He's saying that's the best and safest path for the age. Bhakti yoga needs to be in the center for most people. Not everybody, but for most people. So, now, the best place to begin to understand what Sri Ramakrishna means by jnana yoga, which is the main focus of the talk, is his description of the 7 planes of consciousness, or the 6 chakras, which people are familiar with in Tantra, he spoke this on June 8, 1883. He says, there's much similarity between the 7 planes described in the Vedanta and the 6 centers of yoga. the first three planes of the Vedas may be compared to the first three yogic centers, namely Muladhara, Swadhisthana, and Manipura. With ordinary people, the mind dwells in these three planes, at the organs of evacuation and generation and at the navel. When the mind ascends to the fourth plane, the center designated in yoga as Anahata, heart center, heart chakra, it sees the individual soul as a flame. Besides, it sees light. Shikarne jivatma darshan hoy. It sees light, jyoti darshan hoy. At this, the aspirant cries, what is this? What is this? Sadhak bole, eki. It's a wondrous realization when consciousness finally ascends to the heart center. Because suddenly, after so many lifetimes, you realize that you are not the body, you are not even the mind, but you are a luminous eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of that realization. Then he continues, when the mind rises to the fifth plane, the throat center, the aspirant wants to hear only about God. This is the Vishuddha center of yoga. The sixth plane and the center known by the yogi as Ajna are one and the same. When the mind rises there, the aspirant sees God, personal God. But still there is a barrier between God and the devotee. It is like the barrier of glass in a lantern, which keeps one from touching the light. King Janaka used to give instruction about Brahmagyana from the fifth plane. Sometimes he dwelt on the fifth plane and sometimes on the sixth. After passing the six centers, the aspirant arrives at the seventh plane. Reaching it, the mind merges in Brahman. The individual soul and the supreme soul become one. The aspirant goes into samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi. This is the goal of classical Advaita Vedanta. His consciousness of the body disappears. He loses the knowledge of the outer world. He does not see the manifold anymore. His reasoning comes to a stop. So there's a lot packed in here, and it needs to be unpacked a little. Ordinary worldly people, where is their consciousness centered? On the lower three centers. As a result of which, they're only interested in the things of the world, worldly pleasures of various sorts. What one eventually realizes, it takes most of us way too long, unfortunately, but that's the fact of it, many lifetimes. What do we realize? Desire, worldly desire, is like a wound that never heals. No matter how much we fulfill our desires, we try to fulfill our desires, it doesn't actually fulfill the desire. What happens? The desire grows bigger. Like a wound getting bigger and bigger. Instead of the wound healing, the wound gets bigger and bigger. Bhagavata Purana says, na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogyena shamyati. Havisha krishnavatmeva bhuye evavivartate. Desire is never satisfied through fulfillment, enjoyment. Rather, if you have a fire and trying to extinguish it, and you throw ghee, clarified butter in the fire, what happens? The fire increases. It takes us many, many lifetimes to realize that a life centered around those three lower centers, maximizing our pleasure, a hedonistic life, is a recipe for unhappiness. We'll never get what we're actually looking for, which is contentment, happiness, joy. And so what happens finally? We become spiritual aspirants. We embark on spiritual life. We practice the 4 yogas. And I'm going to try to explain them one by one now. For Sri Ramakrishna, he says, the first meaningful spiritual experience a spiritual aspirant has is when that spiritual aspirant elevates his or her consciousness to the heart center. You don't realize God, you don't realize the Atman, you realize yourself as an eternal soul, as a spark of the divine fire, as a child of God, separate from the body-mind complex. That's the first meaningful spiritual experience the spiritual aspirant has. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says it in such strong language. The sadhaka says, hiki. It's a complete revolution in that person's values. Suddenly he realizes he's not the body-mind, he's a soul. Suddenly at the same time he realizes, wait a minute, but all of you are also souls, you're not body-minds. It's a wondrous realization. After that, you come up to the throat center. After you realize yourself as a soul, you practice bhakti yoga, Ramanuja's bhakti yoga, constantly thinking of God. That's when you reach the throat center. Remember how Sri Ramakrishna explains it. You can't think or hear of anything other than God. That's Ramanuja's bhakti yoga in the true sense, in the strict sense. So notice the similarities here. Ramanuja says jnana yoga is a prerequisite to practice bhakti yoga. Sri Ramakrishna is saying you have to first elevate your consciousness to the heart level and realize yourself as an individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. That's what Ramanuja calls Atma Avalokanam. Only then will you feel that thirst for God, for the divine. and genuinely feel love for the divine. And then ultimately culminating in what? Consciousness elevated to the fifth center, the throat center. You think constantly of God and not of worldly things anymore. Next, sixth center, between the eyebrows, what happens? You have direct spiritual realization of the personal God. This is the culmination of Ramanuja's bhakti sadhana. Sri Ramakrishna says, but that's not all. If you want, you can also get Brahma Jnana, in the sense of knowledge of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Consciousness ascends to the seventh plane, Sahasrara Chakra, the 1,000-petal lotus. And then he adds something even more radical. You might think, well, this supports classical Advaita, but no. Then he says, but the Vijnani is like the person who runs a boat race, shuttles back and forth between the sixth and seventh planes, who loves to revel in God both as Nitya and as Leela, loves to think of God not just as impersonal, but also as personal. Okay? So now, where does that leave us? These sixth and seventh planes are extremely high ideals. God realization, realization of the personal God, realization of the non-dual Atman, Vijnana even harder. How is that relevant to us? He says, your first priority in spiritual life needs to be to elevate consciousness, your consciousness, from the lower three centers to the heart center. That's extremely important, because if the goal is too high, we get discouraged. We don't have that motivation to kind of fuel us in our day-to-day spiritual life. So the practical goal that's practicable for us on a daily basis needs to be something that's more within our reach. Okay? And that is, realize yourself as the soul separate from the body-mind complex through a combination of the four yogas. So now, just to summarize my understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on spiritual practice, he says, he's going to agree with Ramanuja that for most spiritual aspirants, what we should do is a combination of Vaidhi Bhakti, which is all its standard devotional practices, praying to God, thinking of God, doing japa and meditation and so on, coming to arati and talks and all that. Jnana Yoga, which I'm about to explain, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga. What's the result of practicing all these yogas? We raise our consciousness to the heart center. We realize ourselves as eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. That's a prerequisite for attaining what he calls a state of raga bhakti, a feeling of genuine longing for God. That's when we reach the throat center. Only then, he says, once you feel a genuine vyakulata, longing for God, you'll know that the goal is not that far anymore. It's like the rosy dawn before the sun comes up. So what's the rosy dawn? God realization between the eyebrows. Wonderful. We get liberation. If you want, and you're not content with eating sugar, and you want to become sugar, go ahead, go to the 1,000-petal lotus. And even, interestingly, he says, even bhaktas can attain Brahma Jnana by God's grace without even practicing Jnana Yoga in the classical Advaitic sense. That's also important to keep in mind. So now, Bhakti Yoga I've already explained. Now, Bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. This is what I want to focus on. As I said, I think in this regard, the way that Ramanuja understands Jnana Yoga is very similar to the way that Sri Ramakrishna understands Jnana Yoga. We need to meditate on our true nature as eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. What does that mean? Try to change your self-identity. Most of us just instinctively, by default, think of ourselves as bodies or as minds. Try to change that self-identity. Try to think of yourself as a soul. Try to think of other people as souls and interact with them as souls. Even your own children, your spouse, everybody, your co-workers. And Sri Ramakrishna will say in many places, he'll say, there are two kinds of I. One is the rascal I, or the rascal ego, bodhyatami. The other is the I of a devotee, bhaktirami, shantanami. I am a child of the divine. I am a spark of the divine fire. Amritatsya putra. The beautiful statement from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which Swamiji emphasized so much. We are children of immortal bliss. The more we identify as a child of God, as a devotee of God, as a spark of the divine, the more we'll erode our identification with the body-mind complex and start to identify with the deeper soul within. And there are other practices that'll help us to identify with the soul. I'll get to that later in the talk, hopefully. Now, you might be asking, how exactly does this Jivatma relate to God? I've already explained it. It's an amsha, it's a spark of the divine fire. Gita defines it very precisely. It says, In chapter 15, Krishna says, Mamevamsho jivaloke jivabhuta sanatanaha. I, Krishna, have become all the different individual souls that you see, because each individual soul is a portion of me, is a part of me, is a spark of the divine. That's the relationship. So it's only when I realize myself as a spark of the divine fire that I want to go back to the divine source, which is the divine fire itself. That's why I won't feel that genuine vyakulata, that genuine longing for God, until I realize myself as an eternal soul. Swamiji was once asked, how can one have bhakti? Swamiji says, Vivekananda says in response, there's bhakti within you. Only a veil of lust and wealth, kama kanchana, covers it. And as soon as that is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. That's what I was talking about earlier. Each one of us is already a bhakta. We're already children of God. We just don't know it. That's our plight. So through all the 4 yogas, we purify our minds, realize our true nature as eternal souls, which already have an innate love and longing for God. Sri Aurobindo said the same thing in different language. He referred to this individual soul as what he called the psychic being. And he described the psychic being as follows. The natural attitude of the psychic being is to feel itself as the child, the son of God, the bhakta. It is a portion of the divine. One in essence, but in the dynamics of the manifestation, there is always, even in identity, a difference. Even in identity, a difference. That's what Sri Ramakrishna means when he says, bhaktas don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. Even though the jiva is a spark of God, the spark still wants to be slightly separate from the fire so that I can enjoy the fire. You can't eat sugar if you become sugar. I think that's what Sri Aurobindo is saying. Now, compare this with what some of the great Christian mystics have to say about this issue. Some striking parallels. Julian of Norwich, a great Christian mystic, she says, this is from her book, Revelations of Divine Love. She says, we can never come to full knowing of God till we know first clearly our own soul. First realize yourself as soul, then you can realize God. Meister Eckhart, another great Catholic mystic, he says the following. He refers to this Jivatman in beautiful language in Old German or medieval German as Funkelein, which means literally spark soul. Spark of the divine fire, exactly the same language, spark soul, Funkelein. In the spark soul, there is hidden something like the original outbreak of all goodness. Something like a brilliant light which incessantly gleams. And something like a burning fire which burns incessantly. This fire is nothing other than the Holy Spirit. Notice the parallels even in language. Sri Ramakrishna explains this when consciousness comes to the heart center. What happens? You realize the Jivatman in the shape of a flame. Exactly what Eckhart is saying. And then you have a vision of light, Jyoti Darshan Hai. And from a mystical Christian standpoint, he says, this is the Holy Spirit. Realizing your true nature. That soul within us is the Holy Spirit. It's only after realizing ourselves as a spark soul, as the Holy Spirit, that we can realize God as Jesus. That's from a Christian standpoint, but just God. So now, a very important question arises. How exactly does this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, recommended by Sri Ramakrishna, Ramanuja, how does it differ exactly from Shankara's classical Advaitic Jnana Yoga? Number one, and I told you that the main controversial case I'm making is that it's better and safer for most of us to practice this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Ramanuja. Why? What are some of the reasons? Number one, no eligibility requirements. Nothing. You don't need to be equipped with sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana, to get off the ground with practicing the bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. You don't need it. It might be hard to practice, but you can still practice it. And you won't harm yourself. Partly because you're always combining Jnana Yoga with the other 3 yogas, which is forbidden, which is prohibited in classical Advaita Vedanta. Classical Advaita Vedanta says that Jnana Yoga is meant for a higher degree of spiritual aspirant, a higher grade of spiritual aspirant. So when you're practicing the path of knowledge, you don't practice bhakti and karma. The beauty of Jnana Yoga from the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna is, yes, meditate on your true nature as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex, no matter how hard that is for most of us who are identified with the body, very body conscious. At the same time, you should be practicing bhakti yoga. You should be practicing karma yoga. You should be practicing raja yoga, all combined. And it prevents you from becoming one-sided also. Secondly, in classical Advaita Jnana Yoga, you need to look upon this world as unreal, as a dream, as an illusion. How helpful is that to householders? Honestly, ask yourself. My spouse is unreal, my kids are unreal, the job I'm doing is unreal, the salary I'm making is unreal, the car I'm driving is unreal. This is ridiculous. And Sri Ramakrishna will say it's not even true from the highest standpoint of Vijnana. Everything is a real manifestation of the divine. And if you have that attitude, as a spiritual aspirant, you don't need to be a Vijnani. Try to emulate the Vijnani. Try to see your children as divine. Try to see your spouse as divine. Try to see your coworkers as divine. And it'll completely change your outlook. Try to see everyone as divine souls. Another thing is, these days, this is very common, I find, that among people who practice so-called neo-Advaita, they tend to look down on devotees, basically, people who believe in the personal God. You know, like they've scaled the heights of Mount Everest and they're looking down at these poor souls and saying, yeah, eventually, after many lifetimes, you might eventually come up to my level. But good for you for now, and a nice tap on the head. Patronizing, condescending, it's a great danger in the practice of neo-Advaita. Finally, this is the most subtle point, but it's really important. I want you to understand this properly. I'm still trying to work on this. According to classical Advaita, right, the Atman, the only reality, is the non-dual Atman, and that non-dual Atman, pure consciousness, is strictly separate from this world. It has nothing to do with this world. In fact, the world is unreal, so how can it have any connection with the world? It's Sakshi. Even Sakshi is not the highest, because that implies duality. But it's just radical pure consciousness, and this whole world of names and forms, individual souls, all a dream, all an illusion. Okay. How does it help us? Again, not just for householders, but for anybody. For some people it might, but for most people, I think it's dangerous. This is exactly why Sri Ramakrishna says, you can easily deceive yourself and others. It's easy to talk about Advaita. It's easy to intellectually think about it and to feel good about it for a few minutes or seconds. Almost impossible to really practice it for the vast majority of human beings. But it's because if they can talk about it impressively, then it can mislead people into thinking that person's already realized. And then what happens? It might go to your head. And it becomes very dangerous. So now, how exactly is this Jivatma different from the non-dual pure consciousness of classical Advaita Vedanta? This is the crucial subtle point that we need to grasp. It's not completely aloof and transcendental. That's crucial. There is a connection, a deep connection between the individual soul, our nature as eternal souls, and this world. All of us, all the different beings, and even the pews and the tables. What's that connection? Kathopanishad 1.3.3 to 1.3.4 employs a classic metaphor of a chariot. Atmanam rathinam vidhi, shariram ratham evatu, buddhim tu sarathim vidhi manaf pragaram evacha, indriyani hayanahur vishayamsteshu gocharan, atmendriya manoyuktam bhoktetyahur manishinaha. Know the soul to be the master of the chariot, and the body to be the chariot itself. Know buddhi, the intelligent will, to be the charioteer, and the mind to be the reins of the chariot. The sense organs are the horses. Sense objects are the roads, the paths. Wise ones call the soul the enjoyer when it is associated with the sense organs and the mind. So how does this Upanishad explain the Jivatma, the Atma here? Our true nature is the eternal soul, a spark of the divine, but which is still connected to the body and the mind and the buddhi. How? The right understanding of the body and the mind is the body is my instrument. I'm not the body is my instrument. I use the body to achieve my purposes. If you identify with the soul, you don't say the body's unreal or the body's irrelevant. I don't need to take care of the body. No, the body is my instrument to achieve my soul purposes. The soul equally thinks about the mind in the same way. I'm not the mind. And yet, I make use of the mind as an instrument to achieve my soul purposes. You see, because it's the master of the chariot. The person in the chariot is like, imagine a king or something, will tell the rider, the driver, buddhi, go here, go there. The soul is directing the body-mind complex. That's what's crucial. Because of that, because philosophically the soul is connected to the body-mind in this way, the soul uses the body and mind as its instruments, it's far more fruitful and practical on a day-to-day basis as spiritual aspirants. Because then we can identify with ourselves as souls and still not just kind of poo-poo this body or this mind as this kind of lower reality or unreal, it's not helpful to me. No, use it as an instrument. Many of you came by car here. People will think you're crazy if you say, I am my Honda Accord. I hope nobody says that. I drive my Honda Accord to come here. Exactly like that. Kathopanishad is saying, how absurd is it to say I'm the body? I use my body to achieve my purposes, to achieve my ends. I use my mind. I'm not the mind. I use my mind to achieve my purposes, my ends. And then I should also mention that for those of you who are strongly drawn toward a more classical Advaitic paradigm of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, Sri Ramakrishna will even say that you can do that. More power to you if you want to do that, but with some modifications. Okay? What are the modifications? In meditation, this is not, Sri Ramakrishna, I don't think he'll encourage this while you're raising your kids and going to work. He'll say, in your shrine room for a few minutes when you're feeling really up to it, you can meditate on yourself, on your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, Sakshi, all that stuff. Great. Because he believes it. It's real. Brahma Shakti Abhed. So he fully accepts non-dual Brahman in that sense. At the same time, avoid two things. Number one, when you do that, don't look upon bhaktas as devotees. Don't look upon the personal God as a lower reality. And number two, don't think of this world as a dream, which is just not helpful for the vast majority of people. But you can still meditate on non-dual pure consciousness to your heart's content. That's the beauty of it. So if you want to do that, go ahead. But combine that practice also with the bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, which should be a more prominent practice, and Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga and Raja Yoga. Okay? So now, a few practical suggestions about how we can practice Jnana Yoga in our day-to-day spiritual life, and then I do want to get to a little miniature 5 to 7 minute guided meditation on Jnana Yoga. Okay, first, even if you're a bhakta, try to incorporate some Jnana Yoga practice into your daily spiritual life. The bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. Don't just think about, worship God and all that's great. Also try, especially in meditation, it's often helpful to visualize yourself as a light, the radiant light within. Think of yourself as a small light or a spark. Think of God also dwelling in the heart as a bigger light, Jyotira Jyoti, light of lights. So the spark soul is communing with the soul of souls, God. So that you're also, while you're worshiping God and thinking of God and meditating on God, you're also slowly changing your self-identity. You're changing the way you think about yourself. You're no longer thinking of yourself as a body or as a mind, but as an eternal soul, which is a child of God, a spark of the divine fire. Why is that helpful? Because remember, as Swamiji says, we are already bhaktas. We just don't know it because we're identified with the body-mind complex. So the more we identify with the soul, the more we're going to feel that innate longing and that innate bhakti for the divine. Also, be many-sided. So one of the main advantages in this Vijnana Vedanta kind of paradigm is that it encourages us to practice all 4 of the yogas at the same time without feeling guilty about it, without thinking, the more I practice Jnana Yoga, the less I should be practicing bhakti because they're kind of conflicting or they're contradictory. Absolutely not. Practice all of them to your heart's content without feeling any kind of conflict or guilt. Also, a little bit of a subtler point on a practical note. Try to become as sattvic as possible. What do I mean by that? We have to understand the 3 gunas. Most of you probably already know a little bit. Tamas, the energy which manifests as laziness, procrastination, stupor, torpor, and so on. Lethargy. Rajas, the energy that manifests as restlessness, ambition, worldly desires, being full of worldly desires, and so on. Ego, a lot of ego and arrogance, and so on. Sattva, the energy that manifests as humility, compassion, a kind of innate joy that doesn't depend so much on, the mind isn't as externally oriented. It's more indrawn. Gita says there are different kinds of sukham, happiness, joy. And it classifies these 3 kinds of joy on the basis of the 3 gunas. And I'm just going to very briefly summarize. I don't have the time to go through them in detail. But the Rajasika kind of joy is a joy based on sense pleasures. And the structure of all Rajasika joy is the following. It begins like nectar. It starts like, oh, this is amazing. And then what happens? It becomes like poison. Visham. It eventually turns into poison. We all know that through hard experience. Sattvika joy has exactly the opposite structure, 18.37. Yattad agre vishamiva parinamimitum. In the beginning, it's like poison. How many people liked to do spiritual practice at the very beginning? Very few. After the initial honeymoon period, I call it the honeymoon. I've already realized God. And then you, after 6 days or 2 weeks, you come down to earth and you start getting bored. But anyway. But now, Sattvika joy. There's a very important term used in 18.37. Gita says, what's so special about Sattvika joy? Atma buddhi prasadajam. All Sattvika forms of joy are born from the satisfaction of the higher intellect, buddhi, and atma, the jivatma, the soul. Worldly pleasures gratify body or mind or both, the body-mind complex. Sattvika joys, Sattvika forms of happiness gratify the deeper soul within, which means the more we engage in Sattvika activities, the more we try to find joy in Sattvika things, the more we're, in a natural way, the more we identify with the eternal soul within, that radiant light within, rather than the body-mind complex. How do we do that? Read the Gita, read the Gospel, the 2 Gs. Because Sri Ramakrishna, on almost every page, he talks about how to cultivate sattva. Don't be so showy in your spiritual practices. Try to curb your ego. Try to reduce your worldly desires and attachments, all these things. And listening to music, for instance, is very powerful, but it all depends on what kind of music you're listening to. Is it Rajasic? There's plenty of Rajasic music out there. Usually Billboard top 10 kind of stuff is Rajasic. It's got strong beats, very worldly lyrics. Why'd you break up with me? I love you. Why don't you love me? Oh, I'm so sad. More or less, in a nutshell, 90% of worldly songs. Rajasic, Sattvik, Indian classical music, Western, not all forms of Western classical music, but some. There's very spiritual Western classical music. There's a whole genre called sacred classical music. And wonderful bhajans like Nirvananji Maharaj has sung for us. These are Sattvik. The more we listen to these songs, naturally, we don't even need to I'm meditating on myself as a soul, which we're going to do in a second. But it just happens naturally. We move from head to heart naturally. We start to feel for the divine. Okay, so now, other tips. Well, with regard to singing also, there are some beautiful songs which actually talk about the soul and the need to realize the soul. So one of my favorites is a favorite of Swamiji's and one which he sang in front of Sri Ramakrishna. Mano chalo nijo niketone. The song is addressing one's own mind, and here the mind is the soul. Oh soul, come back to your original abode. Come back home. Why are you wandering here wearing the clothes of a foreigner in this foreign land? Don't you feel like you're an outsider, a stranger? Come back to where you really came from. Realize yourself as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. So by listening to the song with concentration, you don't need to do anything more. At least for those moments, you're elevated. The consciousness is elevated up to the heart center. That's the beauty and power of music. Another tip, it's often helpful to recite verses from the great scriptures, especially Vedantic scriptures, to remind ourselves of our true nature. And here, I don't have enough time, but I have my go-to favorites, but I'll just mention the numbers. And so one of them is the one that I started with, a very beautiful mantra from the Kathopanishad, 2.3.17, about, these mantras are meditation mantras. They're meant to be meditated on, every word, every syllable. Sanskrit language is extremely powerful. Many of you are initiated. You're given a Sanskrit mantra. Why? Why in the US are you given a Sanskrit mantra? Why not translate it? It loses all of its, at least a lot of its power. Understand the meaning of the Sanskrit, but know that the original meaning, the original words themselves have a profound spiritual power. Manana trayate mantraha iti mantraha. Just repetition of the mantra itself is a spiritual practice because the words have a spiritual power. And so repeating the verse is a very helpful way. If the mind is about to succumb to lower impulses, repeat a scriptural verse. Raja Maharaj, Brahmanandaji specifically recommends, repeat, he says, you should memorize Gita. Why? Because suddenly a Gita verse might save you when the mind is plunging downward. And it'll pull you up right at the moment when you need it. That's why memorizing is helpful. I always tell people to memorize. It's not good, because that book may not be handy, you know? Not everybody's carrying pocket Gitas like I do. But so memorize. And the other thing about memorizing is, once you memorize it, you're able to internalize the spirit of that verse, that mantra, in a way that if you just read it from a book, it doesn't have the same effect, because it's a mental recitation when you've memorized it. But there are plenty of other verses. I'll just mention the numbers. Mundak Upanishad 3.1.5, about the Atman, reminding us of our true nature. The beautiful Kathopanishad verses about body as a chariot, the soul as the master of the chariot. Any of these, anything that works for you, tailor it to yourself. So now, finally, I promised that we'd do together a 5 to 7 minute guided meditation, and then we'll close with, I'm very thankful that Swami Nirvananji has agreed to sing a closing song as well. So the best possible way to end this talk after this meditation. Please gently close your eyes. Visualize a light, a divine light in your heart, an effulgent light. And please repeat after me. I am the radiant light within. I am eternal. I am luminous. I am free from blemish. I am a spark of the divine fire. I am not the body. The body is my instrument. I am not the mind. The mind is my instrument. I am the radiant light within. Now, as you continue to visualize this effulgent light in your heart, the eternal soul, the radiant light within, please chant with me. I'll be chanting Om. Now, as you continue to visualize this radiant light of the soul in the heart, mentally chant the Om. So now not out loud anymore. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Chapita Tvameva, Tvameva Bandhu Jasaka, Tvameva, Tvameva Mata, Chapita Tvameva, Tvameva Bandhu Jasaka, Tvameva Vidya Dravinam Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva Udeva Tvameva Vidya Dravinam Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva Uddeva. Thou art my mother, my father, thou art my brother, my friend, thou art my mother, my father, thou art my brother, my friend, thou art my wisdom, my wealth, thou art my light of lights, thou art my wisdom, my wealth, thou art my whole light of lights, thou
Thank you so much to Swami Nirvananji Maharaj for singing a second song, amazing songs which are the best example of sattvika music, spiritual music that naturally makes us feel that we're souls separate from the body-mind complex in a very beautiful and natural way, that we're all children of God. Thank you so much. And as for announcements, next Sunday, Pravrajika Brahma Prana Mataji of the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of North Texas will be giving a talk called Karma Yoga for the Jnani.
And the day before, we'll be able to practice Karma Yoga.
And the day before, there is the practice of Karma Yoga from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., followed by lunch afterward on Saturday, the 24th. So please come for that as well. Anything else that I need to mention? No? Oh yeah, those things. There are refreshments outside, so please help yourself. And I'm in a different state now, thanks to Bhajananji and the meditation and all that. I'm a little out of it. And then we have Q&A, question and answer session in the greenhouse living room after refreshments. So hope to see you all there. I'm sure you have questions. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu